So way back when I was in law enforcement uh, in San Jose, California, if we were working a serial rapist or bank robber, we'd have a big map on the wall, and we'd start putting pins in wherever the person hit. And there's a lot to be said by that. By you could almost count on where they're going to go next. The first location, say a robbery suspect hits, is a location pretty close to their residence, and then they start to move out from there. Now, when I first started to look at, say, 300 cases, in the back of my mind, I thought, I remember this location somewhere, and I'd dig back and I'd find it. And as I kept going forward, and my living room had maybe 50 stacks of cases, I'd say, you know what? I think I'm going to get a big map, and I'm going to start plotting these things because it's not making a lot of sense. But I'd like to see if there's clustering of it. And son of a gun, pretty quick, it came out that there were these clusters. And the more I've gone on, the more the clusters have revealed themselves. They start on the West Coast. They start in the Sierra Nevada range, go straight up through Oregon, Cascades, Washington Cascades, up over the top of Idaho, Montana, down through Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, parts of Arizona, then right through the middle of the U.S., North Dakota, South Dakota, going straight south. There's this huge gap of almost no cases, which I get a lot of people writing to me about. Then it starts up again on the East Coast, going right up the Appalachian Trail, and it completely encircles the Great Lakes, which is interesting. And in essence, 80% of the cases are within 200 miles of a large body of water, which is important. We're talking about the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Great Lakes. And if you look at those statistics, I've always said water is an important part of this, and I can't figure out why, but it is. And then each cluster has to fit, each case in each cluster has to fit a specific set of profile points that after you've looked at 5,000 cases, you can see that there's a steady flow of specific circumstances if they're going to be included in our work. The most predominant one, somebody goes missing, they bring in canine dogs to search for you, and they can't pick up a scent. And that's just not one dog. That could be multiple dogs. The other top one is they bring in professional trackers, and they can't find tracks leaving the scene to locate you. Now, both those things are not normal, Jay.
No, not at all.
And from that, there's a whole series of others. Namely, there's a weather event in close proximity to either the time the victim went missing or at the time search and rescue starts their search. And many of the times, this weather event wasn't predicted, so it's kind of strange. And then there's boulder fields that are involved in this, and if the victim's found, many, many, many times, they're found in an area that's been previously searched, sometimes 20 times. And this isn't a criticism of search and rescue, because I think these people do a great, great job. This is more just this statistical fact that I can't explain, and neither can many others, about why these victims are found in an area that's been covered upside down and sideways by search and rescue people.
Gotcha. So you wrote the book Missing 411, Hunters, Unexplained Disappearances, and then the movie. The movie is Missing 411, The Hunted. All the people that you've profiled in the movie are all hunters and or had an experience at either hunting or hunters themselves that had disappeared. Let's talk about the movie a little bit. How did you choose which cases you're going to profile? Because going back, you've studied beyond this little subset that are relative to hunting. You've studied far more than are profiled in the book. You've profiled 1,200 something plus cases.
That's correct. Okay. There's 8 books, and there's just one book about hunters. Now, at the time the movie was released, I released the second book. We took that first hunter's book and kind of tossed it in the garbage, added 40 more cases, same title, Missing 411 Hunters, but it's way bigger, 40 more cases, a little more analysis, and covers the topic, I think, even better at this point.
Gotcha.
But in picking the cases for the movie, that was not easy, because after meeting many victims' families, I know that whoever we give the visibility for on these cases, another case isn't going to get it. So I take this into consideration when we're thinking about it. And the cases have to, of course, fit the profile. If they're in the book, they do. But in these cases, they were, in our minds, the strangest of the strange. And in the book, I say that there's an abnormal number of bow hunters that disappeared versus rifle and pistol. I can't explain that. And as bow hunters know, you're carrying a bow that isn't that heavy, but it's heavy enough that if your life started to be on the fringe, you'd drop the bow. And if you got really tired, you'd drop your pack. Well, the strange thing is, in these cases, you're not seeing that. And that's bothersome. They don't even find anything on some of these people, which is really strange. Now, everyone knows if you're a rifle hunter, the rifle's your prized possession. But if your life's on the line, you might be dropping things just to stay alive. But a rifle hunter has something over a bow hunter, and that is they have a signaling device, that rifle.
Right.
And many people, I learned this from guys that have been hunting for years, many people haven't been taught that if you're lost as a rifle hunter, you carry 20 rounds. Just don't carry 2 or 3. You carry 20. If you're lost, you fire off 3 rounds in rapid succession, and that tells your group that something's wrong. You're lost. Stay in one place. In another hour, fire off 3 more rounds. In another hour, fire off 3 more rounds. And people will eventually find you.
Right.
Bow hunter is a little different. Unless you're carrying a pistol, like I tell every bow hunter to do, it's tough. You don't have that signaling device.
Right. And it's like classic hunter safety, right? You should fire 3 shots if you're lost. And
yeah, but it's surprising, Jay. A lot of hunter safety classes aren't teaching this.
That's really weird. It's weird to me. It seems like that was such a rudimentary part of carrying a firearm. It wasn't just to kill the game that you're hunting. It was to save you if you got lost. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
It's basic stuff. So the clusters themselves, you said that these clusters are points where activity occurs. But you mentioned something just a moment ago that I think is interesting. Is that there are pockets where these things don't occur. Is there any explanation as to why they're not occurring in certain spots?
Oh, thousands and thousands of people have read the books and seen the first movie, and I get all kinds of responses. I've had probably over 25 different kind of maps sent to me and said, oh, this matches your cluster map. And nothing ever does.
Right.
But it's interesting because there's so many different perceptions based on topography, geology, aquifers. It goes on. And I don't think we found the real reason. It is in an area where it's unique, but you can't say that there's not mountains in North Dakota, South Dakota, so there's mountains there.
Right.
But in the plains in the middle of the U.S., I know that there's hunting going on. There's a lot of bird hunting, and
right.
You don't hear about that. So I'm really at a stumped loss to say.
It is funny, though, isn't it? Like you get so focused on the where things are happening that sometimes you should study where things aren't happening and why. It's just an interesting perspective. And what you just said, it clicked. Like, wait a minute, there's a whole cluster where things are not occurring. That's almost as interesting as where they are occurring.
Well, and we have discussions about this all the time, mainly because in law enforcement, like I said, the closest incident usually is the one closest to the suspect's home.
Yeah.
And they will never commit a crime close to home because they'll be identified.
Right.
So now one of the 2 states where there's very few disappearances that match our profile is Mississippi and Alabama. Alabama has a couple, but Mississippi essentially has nothing.
Huh.
And that makes no sense to me because there's a lot of hunting that goes on there.
Yeah, and it's kind of rural. It's swampy. There's spots where you can't even drive. Boats. It is odd. Very bizarre. Let's talk about some of your profile points, because I know this is kind of how you start to digest and investigate some of these clusters. And what are some of these profile points that you look at when you get a call and say, hey, this fits what you're looking for?
So in a missing persons case, I always try to get the law enforcement and search and rescue documents. And depending on the state and the jurisdiction is dependent on whether you're even ever going to see them. But reading news articles isn't very helpful 90% of the time. But when you get the search and rescue documents or law enforcement documents about the disappearance, they will say what type of response they had from the canines, if they found anything in the field. After a couple weeks, if they think the person's deceased, they'll switch from a scent-sniffing canine to a cadaver dog. Now, 95% 9% of the time, if they aren't getting anything on a scent sniffing canine, then they're not going to get anything on a cadaver dog either. So that's the number one thing I look for. Number two is if they're bringing in professional trackers and they can't find anything. Now you get those 2 points together, and you get credible people saying, no, the person was right here when we last saw them and they left walking that direction. And those two groups say that they can't find anything. Boy, I'm looking at that hard, because that's not normal.
Okay. All right.
Now, when let's say you and your buddy go into the field and you're hunting and you're on a ridge and you say, okay, I'll go this way, you go that way, we'll meet at the bottom at the cars at 3 o'clock. I cannot tell you how many times in my books I've written about stories just like that, and one guy never shows up and he's never found. Now, in every book and in the movie, I talk about this, and in every interview, I'll lay it out for you guys again, that if you're going out into the wilderness alone, you are foolish not to carry a personal locator beacon. That costs about $200 on Amazon. There's no monthly fees. It's a transmission device. You activate it, sends a transmission up to a satellite. The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the U.S. monitors it. They see an alert. They look at the GPS coordinates, and they send search and rescue, and they will find you within 10 feet of that signal. And when you're in the field, I actually did this 2 years ago. We're filming a case in Australia, and I was on a book tour. We're in a national park, and I'm going over this boulder, and I'm carrying a camera rig on my shoulder, several $1,000s. I go over the top of the boulder. It had just rained. I slip, and I did everything I could not to drop that camera, and I put too much weight as I awkwardly bent backwards, and I broke my right fibula.
Oh.
And here I am. I'm with one other person in the middle of nowhere, and I know what I did. And I thought, oh, crap, I've got to walk out of here. And luckily, I was able to get out of there barely. But if I completely broke my lower leg, I'm screwed. I'm going to be there. You're not walking out of there.
Right.
And if you're off trail, then it's going to be really hard to find you if you're a bow hunter and you don't have a signaling device.
Right. Wow. It's scary. It is scary.
It is very scary, and I don't think enough people in the hunting community, whether it's macho-ness or what it is, think, oh, it'll never happen to me. Mm-hmm. But guys and ladies, I've written about 1,200 people who never thought it would happen to them.
It makes me think back to a time in my younger days, in my 20s. I was young, brave, outdoorsman, never really thought much of what happens if I don't come home. Decided to go for a mountain hike after a big snowstorm on Mount Moosilauke in New Hampshire. And we ascended as far as we could and then started running out of daylight, or at least the amount of time we knew we had to get back down, just me and my buddy. Went to take a swig of water, and as I opened the bottle of water, I twist the cap, and the entire thing freezes. Like, it was cold enough to freeze. It just needed that exposure to air, and then the whole bottle froze. It made me realize how cold it was, first of all. And then on the way down, I take one step on a rock that is under the snow, and I slip, and I fall down. And whatever pointy rock was there, it absolutely smashed my tricep on my right arm. And for, I don't know, a week and a half, I had one of the most massive bruises I think I've ever had in my life, playing sports, anything. And it just stayed there, and it made me think, like, that was really stupid. I had no GPS. I had no communications other than with my buddy. We were out in the middle of this, it just snowed. Tracks, sure, but nobody else was hiking that day. I just slipped on a rock. What if that was my head? What if that was something vital? Now I'm really screwed. So, the things we do when we're young, but just like you described, man, I'm in the middle of nowhere. I got one guy with me, and I just broke a bone. It's scary.
Yeah, it's an odd scenario, and I don't think a lot of people believe it will happen to them. And I'm more careful, but I've hiked all over North America and other parts of the world, and I can tell you I've fallen down mountains, and luckily I haven't broken my leg before doing that stupid stuff. And thinking, if I was by myself, and I broke my leg, I'd die right here.
Right. It did dawn on me that I would have been dead if that had struck any vital area.
Yeah.
So, while we're on the subject of safety, and you brought this up in the movie, what are the safety points that you like to remind hunters about besides just the beacon and a GPS unit? What are some of the other things that you recommend all hunters, all outdoorsmen bring into the woods for?
So if you're carrying a rifle or a pistol, carry 20 rounds. Don't be cheap about that. Carry the extra rounds because that could also save you. There's I carry this little tiny emergency blanket that's about the size of your fist. Costs $6. It weighs nothing. You get trapped out there, that will save your life. The one I have is bright orange, so I can use it for multiple things to signal if I'm hurt or whatever. But I always tell people to carry that. Other guys, I was working with a guide in New Mexico, and he's in the movie, and he said, Dave, yeah, $6, that's nothing. I agree with you, but I always tell my people to just carry a garbage bag because you can use that as a poncho and a lot of other things. That also weighs nothing, and that gives you a small amount of insulation from the rain. That's a good idea. Always carry one extra bottle of water than what you think you'll need. There's some great energy bars out there right now that really don't weigh nothing. You could actually live off one of those energy bars a day. So I always carry 3 of them in my backpack. And then this is another thing. You don't even have to tell anyone you're carrying it. Is a whistle.
Right.
If you're really depleted and you can't yell loud, you can blow a whistle pretty loud, and people can hear that from a long ways away. So I always tell people to carry that. And some of the most important things: always tell people where you're going, when you're coming out, and only tell a person that you trust a lot, because that person can't hesitate to call search and rescue if you're not back in time, because that could mean your life.
Right.
Always check the weather before you go in somewhere. A lot of people don't do this, and if there's a huge front coming in, may not be the time to go out.
Point well taken. Excellent. Let's take a little break, and when we come back, we'll pick up where we left off with Dave Paulides, Missing 411, The Hunted.
Rackology Deer Supplement and Attractant, developed through years of intense scientific research, comes a product that puts it all in one bag. Superior attractant, scientifically formulated vitamins and minerals, and all at a much better price. To get yours today, please check out rackology.org for a list of dealers. Rackology, how can you afford not to use it? Everything deer need, all in one bag.
And now back to our interview with Dave Paulides, Missing 411, The Hunted. So you transition from the book into a movie. What made you decide to want to make a movie?
Well, we did the first movie, Missing 411, and we highlighted a series, 5 children that disappeared in the wilderness. And in that movie, a friend of mine, Les Stroud, Survivor Man, had read my books. And he said, Dave, there's a great message in here. We could save a lot of people's lives. When you make your movie, if you have a case that can use me, and call me. So I told him the story, and I said, maybe you could come in and try to replicate the trip this kid made, and it'd be good for the viewers to see it. He goes, hey, great. Well, we met in northeast Oregon, and this 2-year-old boy disappeared from this rural ranch. He's playing with his brothers and things, and he vanished. And big search. The community got together, and 12 hours later, they find him 9 miles away, over 2 mountain ranges, over barbed wire fences, face down in the snow. Anyone who's have kids, you can't tell me that a 2-year-old could make that distance in that time, in the dark, because he made that trip from 5 at night to 5 in the morning.
Yeah, no way. Not going to happen.
And Les brought up a great point in that movie. He said, that's 9 air miles. He goes, Dave, nobody walks air miles in the mountains.
Right.
You could easily double that distance. And so about halfway through that journey, Les stopped the crew and he goes, hey, we're not doing this. He goes, I can't do it. He goes, I'd walk off a cliff. I'd be dead. We've only made 2 miles in 6 hours. There's no way I could do this. This is ridiculous. And we had a big discussion, and then we highlighted a series of other kids that disappeared. And the point of that movie was, it's hard for people to appreciate the uniqueness of these stories if I talked about a man like you or I, Jay, that disappeared and were found 8 miles away in the wilderness. Not that unbelievable.
Right.
But when you highlight really young kids, it perks people up to say, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And the answer is, I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
But there's There's 5 stories. A couple of them are in national parks. A lot of them are in, all of them are in rural areas, and many of them are still unsolved, and the boys were never found. And these are such rural areas that there was no serial killer out there. There's no tracks, there's no scent trail, blah, 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 just like it is in all the profile points, and they are giant unknowns. So that movie was made to pick up people's awareness that there's something strange happening here. The second movie was designed so that people could understand that hunters, they're armed, they know how to use their weapons, they know how to defend themselves, and many, many times hunters are in an area that they've sometimes hunted for decades. So the idea that these people are getting lost in these areas that are their hunting grounds for decades doesn't make any sense. That's how we kind of picked this topic.
Gotcha. Okay. So in the movie, you break it down into 5 incidences or 5 missing persons or some element of an oddity that you can't explain. In chapter 1 is the Lily Pond incident with Tom Messick, and that's the one I really want to focus on in this show. I don't think we have time to discuss all 4 of them or all 5 of them in detail, but I do want to go back to the Tom Messick story. You have the Santa Fe clusters, and one of the things that really made me wonder what in the heck was going on is when you explained that while they're searching for the missing hunter, in that case, that dogs tracked that person all the way to the blind, but then they couldn't track beyond the blind? It didn't make any sense to me.
Well, therein lies the conundrum of these cases. I mean, you have a bull hunter, he's with his buddies, just like I said, point of separation. You're with your buddies. This guy had a bad knee. He goes, hey, I'm walking, points to his blind that he made. I'm walking 110 yards right there to my blind. I'm going to come back to the car after 4 or 5 hours. I'm not going anywhere else. Hey, no problem. They see him take off. They go the other way. At the end of the day, he doesn't show up. They go down to the blind. They don't see him. Make a long story short, search and rescue comes in. They put the dog at the car. The dog tracks right to the blind. That's it.
Yeah. That makes no sense to me at all. I mean, clearly the dogs were doing what they were trained to do. They did what they're supposed to do. But then you just can't go beyond the blind. It makes no sense because the hunter was there. Obviously, he's not there now. Where did he go? Chapter 3, you talk about an incident in Montana down around the Crazy Mountains, which is just a great name for a set of mountains for things to go absolutely completely wrong. And it makes me wonder, what happened, Aaron Hedges, what happened to this guy? Grizzlies, wolves, I don't know. It's as you said, completely unexplained, and the movie makes you leave with more questions than answers. I can give you that. You talk about there's a section. Let's see, chapter 4 around the Donnell Vista. Is that? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. And a cluster not far from Yosemite, and you mentioned that Yosemite is actually one of the largest clusters of missing persons in the world. Can you explain that for a sec?
Sure. No other cluster comes close. And when I originally started this trek, I sent a Freedom of Information Act request to the National Park Service asking for a list of missing people from Yosemite and from the national parks as a whole. Originally, a lawyer from the National Park Service calls me and asks why I want the information. And legally, they can't use my response as a determining factor if they're going to give me the information. I knew this. And I said, well, why are you asking? That's strange. He says, no, we're just interested. And I said, well, I'm just doing research. And he says, well, we don't have any lists of missing people from the National Park Service or from Yosemite. And I said, well, you have a large contingent of federally trained law enforcement officers that are National Park Police officers, and you have detectives called special agents that are working for the Park Service. They're really well-trained people. You can't tell me that they don't know the importance of keeping lists and looking at various missing people and seeing if there's parallels here. He goes, no, there's no lists. And I said, well, okay, I'm a published author, so I'm going to use the Freedom of Information Act exemption. I want you to go get that list for me free of charge. 6 weeks later, they come back to me, and they said, it was humorous. They go, Dave, your books aren't in enough libraries to qualify for that exemption. Now, Jay, there's no such thing in the Freedom of Information Act. They made that up.
Right.
They just didn't want me to have it. And I said, okay. So if I want to pay for it, what's it going to cost me? They said $1.4 million if you want the list from the National Park Service. That's what it'll cost us to go put it together. Now, 8 years later, from when I first had that conversation, I've written about 50 people in Yosemite that have disappeared. And son of a gun, this year, Yosemite came out with a list of 50 people who have disappeared from Yosemite.
And are there more than 50?
Maybe.
Maybe.
I have no
You don't
idea.
know.
I mean,
Right.
yeah, I'm sure there's more now because they came out with that list about 9 months ago, and I've seen that there's more people that have disappeared. But
Isn't that interesting?
they don't want to tell anybody unless I first write about it, I guess.
Right. Okay. So it's like you called them on it. Hey, here are 50 that I know of. Oh yeah, here's the 50 list, by the way.
Right.
Wow, that's crazy.
So, yeah, the clusters, Yosemite has, well, I say this all the time. When I say boulders and granite fields, what's the biggest granite field in the world? Well, that's Yosemite. And you'd think, well, these people are disappearing way in the backcountry. No, a lot of these people in Yosemite are disappearing under the most odd conditions you can imagine, meaning they're staying in the valley floor and they tell their family, hey, I'm going to go take a 2-hour hike, I'll be back. They disappear, they're never seen again, and they're never found. And that is really strange.
That is strange. And a lot of these people are experienced hikers, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Chapter 5, you cover a really odd incident in Lima, Ohio. Talk about a place where you don't expect oddities to occur, right? It's not exact. I mean, it's rural in a sense because it's Ohio, but it's not exactly rural where there's like desolate areas of nothing. This is a community, and multiple things happen in this case with a hunter that she saw something in a tree stand, but it also corresponded to an equally odd event that several people witnessed from a band practicing on a ball field.
So over the years, since the book came out, I've had 50, 75 different hunters that have written to me about odd things that have happened to them in the woods, maybe 100 by now. And I think all these people are credible because they're not asking for any notoriety or anything. They're just being very nonchalant and saying, hey, this happened to me, and I've always wondered if other people, it's happened to them. And hunters, on the whole, pretty quiet, to themselves kind of guys that really don't want to talk about this kind of stuff. But I started to go through these, and when we were putting the movie together, we thought, let's take a couple of these stories that we can look at as being credible and prove that they occurred, and at least some evidence to prove that they happened. And we took 2 cases. And first of all, people don't know, Ohio has some big bucks. And I'm talking trophy, huge bucks.
Absolutely. Land of the Giants. One of the best.
Oh, my.
Buck country galore. One of the best buck states in the entire world.
When we were out there filming, we saw some huge ones that were out in the soybean field. And this is right next to where this incident happened. We go, oh, my God. And then the people that were hosting us said, yeah, this is like normal, Dave. I said, oh, who would think out in the middle of Ohio you'd have this? But anyhow, I'll make the long story short. This woman, bow hunter, sitting in a blind in a tree about 15 feet up. I won't tell you exactly what she saw, but she saw something really strange.
Yep.
Really strange. And she didn't realize at the time. She almost like lost time. But she had her camera out, her phone camera, and she took a picture somehow or another. And at the same time this is occurring, her nephew is doing band practice about 2 miles away on this field at a high school. And the entire band is out there, and they see this UFO fly over and hover over their band for like a minute. So simultaneously 2 things are going on. Now here's the really odd part if that isn't enough. The husband of the woman in the blind is an optical physicist. I've known him for 20 years. He's one of the smartest men alive, and I'm not kidding you. Anytime I have a strange photo, I send it to him. Why? Because he knows his stuff inside out and backwards and can tell me if it's phony, fake, or whatever. Well, that night, the kid in the ball field calls his uncle because he knows his uncle is into weird stuff and looks at photos, and he tells his uncle what everyone in the band saw. He calls Verizon, sends them the picture, and says, how did this phone take this picture? Because the pixel rating on the picture says that the phone can't take it. Verizon comes back and says, well, that phone took that picture, but according to the engineers, that's impossible that the phone took the picture. And I know this doesn't make sense, but that's a fact.
Yeah.
Because the software and the calibration internally on the engineering of the phone couldn't have done it, but it did it.
Right. It's
So that's pretty strange, Jay.
you think? I mean, it doesn't make any logical sense on how a phone would change the dimensions that it's programmed to take a photo of. Like, you can't change the picture size. I mean, it is what it is, and then suddenly this happened. So there are a lot of these little details that are highlighted throughout the movie, and every single case in the movie itself, for chapters 1 through 5. Each one is mesmerizing. You get glued to the television set or the movie theater, wherever this, and we'll get into where people can see this. But the one case I want to go back to is the Tom Messick case. The one you opened with in the movie. It's the Lily Pond area case. And it goes back to 2015, Northeast New York. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is over just northeast of Lake George. Is that correct?
You know, I'm not great on New York geography. I know it's north of Albany, about an hour and a half.
Okay, that's about right. Yeah, I think it's in that Lake George area, which is not far from me. I've been through there. But this case in particular is an odd one because as hunters, I think we've all done this before. You know, some of us are bow hunters, some of us are ground hunters. Certainly in New York, this style of hunting that occurs is common, where you get 4 or 5 hunters on a legal push. You set them up. They're the standers, right? You put them in spots where you think that the deer will come out. They're usually the kids or the older adults that don't have great mobility, and you put them there and you say, stay here until the deer come through, and you shoot if you find the deer that you're looking for. Meanwhile, the other pushers, so to speak, are going up over the top of a mountain or going through whatever thing they're going through, and those are the more mobile aspects of the hunter group. It's a human push. You're taking humans to drive deer towards the hunters that are sitting in hope of a shot, because the deer get stuck in these really thick areas and they won't come out, and it's one method to hunt. I've done it myself. It's certainly different than getting in a tree stand or hunting from a blind with a bow and arrow, but it is effective and very common in New York. What happened, or what are the series of events that happened to Tom Messick here?
So Tom was like a 4-decade-long hunter safety instructor.
Wow.
He and his buddies, 6 guys, owned a hunting lodge up near Brant Lake in New York, and they had owned it for decades. These guys were best friends, did everything together. They fished, they hunt, they were outdoorsmen. They're like good old guys, great guys. And they went to an area where they had never went to before that was state land, and they went in there, and there was a series of their sons and things that were going to do the push. And 4 old guys were going to sit down, and these guys were in their 70s to low 80s. Messick was 82 at the time. And he was one of the 4 sitting on the outside. If you drew a straight line, 1, 2, 3, 4, one guy was near a lake, 2 guys were in the middle, and then Tom was on the outside. And as they're sitting there, you're not going to find this in any of the reports, nowhere, but in interviewing the hunters he was with, one of these guys just, I almost felt like crying because he lost his best friend, and, you know, there's no closure to it. And he says, Dave, we're sitting there. He goes, we were there for a couple hours. And he goes, I've hunted for 55 years. And he goes, on this incident, I heard something I've never heard before. And I go, what do you mean? And he goes, you know how you're in the woods, you hear a twig break or you hear something? We're used to all this. And he goes, no, I heard something that was strange. And he said it was kind of like a giant steel trap maybe slamming shut. And none of the other hunters had heard it but him. And he had heard it somewhere between himself and where the guys were pushing the deer, not towards Tom. But he said it was about mid-time in that span that we were sitting there hunting. And I said, so there were no unusual smells, no other sounds, no rifle shots? Nope. And the other thing was, all of the hunters and the pushers were carrying walkie-talkies on the same channel. And nobody heard anything on the radio during the time Tom went missing. So at the end of the time, everyone groups back together, goes back to their trucks, Tom's not there. Well, his son is one of the guys doing the pushing, and his son starts looking around, and he goes, Dave, he goes, my dad has bad knees. He He's blind in one eye. He's partially deaf almost, and he's not going anywhere, Dave.
Right.
He's walking from the road 40 feet in, 50 feet in, sitting down on this stump, and he's going to wait. And he goes, I thought, okay, the first night, we'll find him by morning. Something weird happened, but we'll find him. And then I called Tom's wife, called his mom and said, we found him. We haven't found him yet, but we will find him, don't worry. And she goes, no, forget it, I'm coming up. This is too weird. So the State Department of Fish and Wildlife shows up, rangers show up that first night, and they start searching, and pretty soon they have hundreds of people up there. And as his son said in the movie, he goes, Dave, we had people asking us, who is this, like the governor's son or something? Because it was such a comprehensive, thorough search. Now, in the books I've written, from writing stories in the late 1950s until today, what people don't know is that the FBI doesn't search for missing people.
Right.
You may think they do, but no, they don't. The only time they ever search for a missing person is when it's a very, very young child. And they have a special classification and protocol that allows them to go and assist in those instances. As far as adults, they don't care. If you think about the amount of responsibility the FBI has, they don't need that responsibility of looking for an 82-year-old man in the woods. It wouldn't make any sense.
Right. It makes no sense.
But what happens? 2 FBI agents show up the second day and all of a sudden start camping out on this event. Nobody knows why they're there. Nobody knows what they're doing, and they tell people they're just monitoring the event. Now remember, we have national security issues, we've got terrorists, and 2 FBI agents in the middle of nowhere in New York about an 82-year-old man who's missing, and they stay there for 6 days. Now, this has happened multiple times on cases I've written about, all the way from 1950 until today. It makes zero sense. There was never any evidence of a crime here. And even if there was, it's not their jurisdiction, it's state land. So I asked one of the search and rescue heads in the movie, I said, have you ever had an FBI agent show up on a search? Never. I said, do you have any understanding why he's there? And he said, well, the only thing that made sense is maybe they were bringing some special tools to assist, but I never saw those, and I never knew why they were there.
Very strange.
Very.
So Tom is 82 years old, can't see out of one eye. He's deaf. They put him on a stand.
No, they just put him on a stump.
Stump. Yeah. Here's your seat, Tom. Sit down.
Right.
Don't move. Shoot a deer if you see one. We'll come by to get you in, an hour?
2 hours.
2 hours. Perfect time for a long-range drive for deer hunting in New York. Makes total sense. All the other guys stay put, but Tom disappeared. Did they ever find a body or anything of that nature? I don't think that was the case, right?
So that one of the search and rescue commanders, who's a high-ranking sheriff's deputy, been searching for decades, he said, Dave, we should have found, at the minimum, his rifle. We should have found maybe scraps of a candy bar he was eating.
Yeah. We
never found anything. And when Tom's wife was debriefed, she said each one of the people that came up and debriefed her said it was so strange because they haven't found anything.
Very strange.
And I know our minds always go to the most simplistic explanation for each one of these disappearances. Oh, maybe one of his friends accidentally shot him. Well, no, because there were no shots fired.
Right.
Maybe he was killed by his friends. He was the most liked guy by everybody in the camp.
Right.
Maybe he walked out. I don't think so. At 82 years old, he's not walking that far.
Right.
And then you start to vet out all of the things that make sense to us as hunters. And this is something that's done on all the cases that I write about by search and rescue before we'll even look at it. So first of all, animal predation. Could a mountain lion, a cougar, or a bear taken him down and killed him? Well, if that was the case, there'd be a pretty big scene there. He'd fight for his life. There'd be scraps of clothing. There'd be drag marks. There'd be blood. No, none of these things are ever found on anything I write about. Could there be a mental health issue? Maybe he wanted to disappear. Maybe he wanted to commit suicide. Nope, that gets vetted out. You go right down this line of 4 or 5 items that they do in search and rescue to define how they're going to search and the effort they're going to put into it, meaning are they going to go out 5 miles, 10 miles, or just 2 miles? Well, depending on the health of the person, depends on how big and how wide that grid is. In Tom's case, nobody thought he'd get outside of 2 miles, but they went way outside of 5 miles, and they still never found anything.
It's fascinating to me because you had the standard search for a missing person. You get a squad of volunteers, some people with all woodsmanship skills to do a search and rescue of some sort. 300 people, I believe, is how it was described to search for Tom. 12 volunteer fire departments. You had New York State. You had dogs, 2 FBI agents for whatever reason, and couldn't find Tom, and who shouldn't have gone far at all. Then I start to rule out, okay, well, grizzly bears. Well, there are no grizzly bears in New York State, first of all. There are black bears, but extremely unlikely that some bear is going to come through a deer push and grab Tom and race away with him. That's not happening. It's unlikely for a black bear to attack anyway. Wolves. Well, there are no wolves up in New York that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's some coyotes, but a pack of coyotes is not going to make Tom disappear. Mountain lions, well, questionable whether mountain lions even exist in New York State, especially in that area. And, what next thing that comes to mind, well, what about a serial killer? Well, who's going to be out in the middle of nowhere if you're a serial killer? There's not enough targets for them, so to speak, right? It doesn't make any sense. So as some of these things unfold, I'm left with more questions than answers. And this is the whole concept of the movie and the book. Like, there's no answers. But you follow the path. You follow the whole breakdown of the search and how this all occurred. It makes zero sense with no explanation.
And, Jay, you're hitting the mark right on. And in the movie, we cover, just a handful of cases. And in the book, I cover, over 150. And after you read a book about this stuff, your head is spinning.
Yeah.
And after I reviewed probably 500 cases for the book, and you think, well, is this just a North America thing? Is this just a continental North and South America thing? No, it's happening. It's also happening in Australia, and I wrote about a case there where very similar to what we were just talking about. But in Tom's case, the hardest thing in all of these incidents is going back and talking to the family. And his wife is one of the nicest people you will ever meet. And she is a completely lost soul because she lost her life companion,
right,
with no answers.
Just leaves you empty, like no answers, just gone. I have no closure whatsoever.
And the one last thing I'll say about the Mesa case is the Adirondacks in New York are a cluster area, and there's some really weird cases I've written about there, so that don't make any sense, just like this, but about hikers and things that have vanished, never found, no evidence of them. And I mean, I've been up there, and your mountains in Upper New York, they're decent, but they're not like where I live in Colorado, where you got 14,000 foot peaks to disappear into.
Right.